Hey y'all, what's up? My name's Angela, and today I have a very fun book idea to propose to y'all. So a few months ago, I was watching Zoe Delaney in one of her weekend vlogs, and she was planning on reading this book that she had never heard of, would have never picked up if not for the fact that in the book blurb, it mentioned one of her favorite books of all time, The Immortalist by Chloe Benjamin. So that really got me thinking about how important blurbs are in drawing in new readers and how publishers actually put together these blurbs and how accurate they might be in their recommendations. You know, that if you like this one author or a series, that you'll definitely like this new author or series. So this week, I'll be putting that to the test by putting together a TBR with books that mention other books that I've liked and read in the past in the book blurb. My criteria was that first, the book blurbs had to come from an official bookseller. I used Barnes & Noble's website. And the second was that the book blurbs had to specifically mention the books or authors that I've read in the past. I was looking for phrasing kind of along the lines of, for the fans of this will be for you. I picked books from several different genres, kind of hoping to get some variety, so I'm excited to share what books I'll be reading for this video. So I first picked 3 books that I really liked in the past. The first was The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue by Mackenzie Lee. This is a historical YA with a very adventurous plot that also has a childhood friends to lovers romance at the center of it. And the book that was a recommendation for fans of The Gentleman's Guide was Dangerous Alliances by Jenica Cohen. This is also a historical YA, more in the veins of a kind of adventurous Pride and Prejudice. The next book I have, very different. I really enjoyed reading Misery by Stephen King. This is a story following an author who gets rescued and then trapped by his biggest fan. And the book that was a recommendation for fans of Misery was You by Caroline Kepnes. This is about a man who works in a bookstore and his obsession with this woman he meets at his work. And the next book is one of my favorite books and authors that I read last year, and it is The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. This is a YA book told in verse about a teenager who feels like she can only express herself through her poetry. And the book that was a recommendation for fans of Elizabeth Acevedo was The Black Flamingo by Dean Atta. This is also a book told in verse about a teen who comes to terms with all parts of his identity through drag. So those recommendations were for 3 books that I really liked in the past, and I thought just for fun we could throw in a book that I didn't really like and see if the recommendation is still very similar and I don't really like the recommendation as well. So the book I didn't really enjoy reading in the past was The Secret History by Donna Tartt. This is a book about a group of university students who take their ritualistic course studies a little bit too far. And the book that was a recommendation for fans of The Secret History was If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. Very much like The Secret History, If We Were Villains is also a dark academia book about a group of university actors who find the lines kind of blurring between their play and their real life. So I'm really excited to see how I'll feel about these books, if I feel similarly to the predecessors they were based on. My goal is really to see how accurate these blurbs are and if I can identify the elements in both books that might have linked them together and made the publishers or the authors reviewing this book feel that they were good recommendations for each other. So I'll see y'all back here again with reviews for each of these books. Hello, I finished my first book for this video, which is The Black Flamingo by Dean Atta. This is a story written in verse following our main character Michael's journey, starting from when he's really young to his first year in university. This is a story about him coming to terms with all the facets of his identity and kind of it culminating into him discovering drag and developing his drag persona. So I was really excited about this book for a long time just because I've heard so many good things about it. I love books written in verse, and I always like books that kind of delve into a person's relationship with their identity, whether it be through race or sexual orientation or through how they identify themselves with their friends and their family. I think those books tend to always really pack a punch. And I think this book managed to take those really big idea topics and condense it down really well into these kind of big main messages in such a short amount of space. I really like that the book dives really heavily into the intersectionality of Michael's identity. He is half Jamaican and half Greek Cypriot, and that kind of identity really affects him when he's younger and him trying to figure out why he doesn't feel like he belongs to either group and how he kind of makes his own space where he feels the most like himself. I also like the fact that for Michael, drag isn't a way to kind of adopt a new personality to hide behind. Rather, it's a way to showcase the truest form of himself. And he feels that the personality he's adopted is an extension of who he actually is. So the reason I picked The Black Flamingo was that in a lot of the blurbs, they often tie this book back to for fans of Elizabeth Acevedo, and I can see a lot of the similarities in the readers for these two authors. Besides the obvious fact that both authors have books written in verse, I think that The Black Flamingo and a lot of Elizabeth Acevedo's books often tie back to this conflict that the main character has with their identity in some form, either them not really feeling like they fit the identity of their family, the identity that other people have imposed upon them, or just feeling very disconnected from who they really are and not being able to show that. Would I say that this blurb recommendation is true? I think that for most general readers, it is pretty fitting. If you enjoy the way that Elizabeth Acevedo approaches these topics in her books, I think you'll really like The Black Flamingo. It takes the same very kind of artistic but also straightforward and bare bones look at a young person's struggle with their identity, and I think those two, well, I guess the two authors have that in common. The thing that I was really missing from The Black Flamingo was this verse and the kind of beauty in the poetry. So I listened to The Black Flamingo on audiobook, and I actually listened to The Poet X for the first time on audiobook as well, and there was just a big difference that stood out to me. In The Black Flamingo, there were certain kind of poems that you could tell it was poetry that either Michael had written or was performing, and it was very purposeful in the kind of rhythm and the cadence of the poem. But for a lot of the rest of the book, it kind of felt just like regular prose. It didn't have, like, the verse didn't feel like it added anything super significant to the listening experience. And I remember listening to The Poet X, on the other hand, for the first time, and just the very purposeful way that it was performed and the different phrasing and the way different words or imagery would hit made the whole experience very raw and emotional, and I could certainly feel, especially the emotional difference, the most between listening to the two books. There's actually so many more similarities than I originally thought. You know, Dean Atta narrates the book, Elizabeth Acevedo narrates The Poet X. They're both written in verse. So I actually think this recommendation is really quite fitting, but kind of that's the differences and the similarities between Elizabeth Acevedo and The Black Flamingo for me. Overall, I've been kind of rambling, but overall, I think that if you enjoy Elizabeth Acevedo's style of writing and you enjoy the topics that she writes about and the way she writes, you will definitely enjoy The Black Flamingo by Dean Atta. Last night, I finished reading Dangerous Alliances. Dangerous Alliances follows our main character, Vicky, who, in order to protect her family estate from falling into the wrong hands, is forced to quickly find a suitor for marriage. In choosing suitors, Vicky's biggest conflict is trying to decide whether she wants to follow her heart or protect her family's duty and kind of step up to the plate as the heir to this estate. While she's in the process of choosing someone for marriage, there seems to be a separate force that is hell-bent on putting her life at risk. So here's the thing. This is a historical novel. So already this doesn't have a lot going for it. I'm not the biggest fan of historical fiction. I kind of chose this one because I recognize that there is a genre of historical fiction that borders on the more light, humorous kind of side, much like The Gentleman's Guide. The biggest similarity is definitely the main character. They both have this main character who is quite childish or naive at the beginning of the book, and the plot forces them to grow up, to kind of take charge of their family, to get their act together, something along those lines. Both books also feature or hint at this kind of childhood friends relationship that might turn into something more. Both books feature female characters that are very strong and kind of different and unexpected from women at the time. And both books kind of poke fun or make jest of the stereotypes for men and women at the time. So I totally get why Dangerous Alliances would be a very natural selection on the surface for fans of The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue. I went into this book with high hopes and I really just did not like it. One thing I didn't like about Dangerous Alliances was just how naive the characters are. Like, they seem purposefully ignorant at times. And this isn't necessarily like just like a isolated character flaw, rather they're ignorant to serve and extend the plot. And that's something that I really don't jive with. There were several times where our main character Vicky, Vicky's father, Vicky's childhood friend Tom, they could have made these very natural leaps in logic based on the information that they had, but they just seemed to refuse to make those connections. And in the book, it's very clear that Vicky is well-read, well-learned, she's smart, she is interested and curious in a lot of different things. So you would think a character like that would make those natural leaps in logic. But she seems almost like purposefully ignorant and unwilling to see these things that are happening right before her eyes. What originally really sold me at The Gentleman's Guide wasn't necessarily, me falling in love with the characters, but rather I thought the plot was really dynamic and very much kind of like a movie. Everything was very vivid, and just being in the world made it seem very action-packed, and there was just so much going on. With Dangerous Alliances, the plot has several layers. You're coming at this kind of big secret from several angles and several perspectives, but none of them were very interesting all the time. They didn't always have something super vital to add, and when there was something vital to add, these characters would just ignore it. In Dangerous Alliances, the concept of romance isn't necessarily the main point, but I think it's this, marriage of convenience and all the accessorizing tropes that kind of go along with this, marriage of convenience that is the main point of the book. And that's why I don't think the romance in Dangerous Alliances was as strong as the one in Gentleman's Guide. This is very personal, but I don't think any of the suitors in Dangerous Alliances were charming. Like, the person she ends up with, didn't care about them. I don't think that they were displayed in the best way. Like, we were supposed to kind of like swoon over them or whatever, but there was not enough development between Vicky and these suitors to make you want to root for these relationships. I don't know, I think this book would have been okay, but I was just so personally frustrated at so many points with these characters, especially Vicky, just because she's described as very like stubborn and headstrong and brave and curious, but her actions don't match that. And so that kind of disconnect really bothered me all the way through the end of the book. So unfortunately, I think I'm going to end up giving this book 2 stars. In terms of how similar or how good of a recommendation it would be to recommend this for fans of Gentleman's Guide, I think it's a pretty good recommendation. Like, there are so many things that these 2 books have in common in terms of tropes, in terms of setting, characters, the writing style. But I think if the historical setting wasn't something that sold you in The Gentleman's Guide, if it was more of like the character interactions, that like development, the kind of tension, or like the kind of really crazy plot that really sold you on The Gentleman's Guide, I don't think Dangerous Alliances is that good of a recommendation. If you like the historical setting of The Gentleman's Guide and kind of the, historical culture of that kind of setting, then I definitely think you will like Dangerous Alliances. And it's definitely a good book to give a try because they have that very much in common. I very much dislike not finishing books for videos, but I think I have to make a special exception for this case because I will not finish reading You by Caroline Kapnis. This book is about a man named Joe, and he works at a bookstore where he meets a woman named Beck, and he becomes obsessed with her to the point where he's stalking her, kind of inserting himself into her life, taking away the people from her life who he feels are monopolizing her time. And this book was a recommendation for fans of Misery by Stephen King. Stephen King himself even wrote a blurb for this book, and Stephen King's book Dr. Sleep is actually also mentioned within You. So there's quite a lot of ties between You and Misery, but in my opinion, I think that this recommendation is very surface level. Sure, you have this obsessive, stalkerish relationship. You have kind of the setting of books and fiction and like authors or writers, kind of that element as well. But Joe and Annie Wilkes are not on the same plane. Like, Annie could beat Joe to a pulp at the snap of a finger. When I was reading Misery, I was genuinely afraid of Annie, but like, I feel like I would fight Joe and I would win. The writing style of You is kind of hit or miss. It's entirely first person, very stream of consciousness style, all from Joe's point of view. And he is a twisted man. He kind of sees things and then twists them to fit his narrative, and you see the entire process of it play out in the book. And I think that's actually pretty interesting because you kind of really get into his head and you kind of understand how he could take something that's a very mundane, normal interaction between him and Beck and how he twists it to fit this like romanticized, very picturesque image that he is making for himself. But I really just hate the man. I hate his narrative. I hate the story between him and Beck. I hate his petty feud with Peach. I don't like that he won't commit, you know? Might be a little bit of a spoiler, so skip a little bit ahead. So Joe kidnaps Benji, who's Beck's ex-boyfriend, and traps Benji in this cage for antique books that Joe has in his bookstore basement. And Joe just will not commit. He won't really torture Benji. Well, he's kind of torturing him, but he like won't torture him and he won't really kill him. So Joe's got like one foot in the door of being complete psycho and he just won't commit to it. And I need this man to decide, are you going to be full out stalker, crazy person, or are you gonna like let this man go and manipulate Beck's life from the sidelines? Because it's one or the other. A few years ago, I did watch the first few episodes of the Netflix adaptation, and I'm just gonna say it now, I really think Penn Badgley saved this entire show. If it were not for him being cast as Joe, I don't think this show would have gotten the traction that it did, because Joe as a character he's disgusting. I hate him. I didn't like him in the show, but imagining Penn Badgley as Joe while reading this made me at least stick through for like 30% of the book. Alas, even Penn Badgley cannot disguise the trash pile that is Joe Goldberg and the trash that is Beck's characterization of Peach. Like, every character in this book is just so they're not one-dimensional, they're just annoyingly annoying. So in conclusion, I guess my opinion isn't fully formed because I haven't read the entire book, so I can't technically tell you if You and Misery are great recommendations, but from what I've read so far, I feel that it is a very surface level recommendation. They just saw these few elements that were kind of similar. You mentioned Stephen King a lot, so suddenly they were tied together. But I think that if you enjoyed Misery, I don't think you'll necessarily enjoy You. I think You is a different brand of kind of stalker relationship. They have a very different vibe. You's not scary. You is just annoying. But Misery genuinely had this like level of horror and just like gore, and you really were on the edge of your seat during that book. And I think there were redeeming qualities of both kind of despicable characters in Misery, while in You, again, the characters, I did not like any of them. Yeah, that's the first dud of the group, the one that I don't think is a great recommendation. And now I'm going to be moving on to the book that, if things go well, I probably won't like, but I want to like this book, obviously. Hello, let's chat. I just finished If We Were Villains by M.L. Rios. Where do I even start? Okay. This book follows a group of 7 student actors. They are part of this very elite university that basically only caters to humanities and the arts. The lines between acting and real life start to kind of blur, and a lot of things happen to this group of friends. So good news is I really enjoyed this book. Even though this was a recommendation for a book that I didn't quite enjoy, I thought that this one was definitely very different from my experience with The Secret History. I think the book does a really good job of introducing and developing the characters throughout the story, because at the beginning you're introduced to these 7 people and they're really just names. They don't have any personalities attached. So the author has to work really hard to kind of associate like personalities, character traits, like just make these people feel like real people. And throughout the book, I feel like these characters really develop into real people for me. And as a reader, I can form individual connections with each of these characters, and they don't seem like caricatures. I think the character development worked a lot better for me than the plot did. The plot itself was also very entertaining. It had that perfect balance of like drama and dreariness, and the development of the stress and strains of this friend group and how quickly and dramatically everything falls apart. The book has a lot of Shakespeare, and to be honest, I'm really not that good at reading Shakespeare. I try my best to kind of read between the lines and make the connections between the plays they were doing and what was happening in real life, because that is actually also a big part of this. The plays really are a reflection of what's going on in their friend group, and especially the ending. Oh my goodness, y'all, the ending killed me. I like, as soon as I finished reading it, I had to look it up because I was like, this can't be what I'm thinking it is. And I'd like to say the optimist in me wants to take the happier approach to this kind of open-ended conclusion, but I think the kind of beauty of this is that the story really like almost doesn't deserve a clean-cut conclusion, and I like that the author reflected that, you know, in the final conclusion as well. So this book was a recommendation for fans of The Secret History by Donna Tartt, and there are definitely a lot of similarities. Besides the dark academia, the character setup is very similar. You know, you have the group of friends, kind of this outsider narrator, and you get to see how the tension and cracks form in this friendship. The setting for both books is also pretty similar. You have this very competitive, elite school environment that exacerbates a lot of the issues and problems that these students are facing. To me, what really differs between these two books is that The Secret History takes a larger focus on using the writing to create this very dark, gloomy, dreary atmosphere. Like, even if I didn't like the book itself, I can't say that the writing was bad. The writing was the top selling point for The Secret History. While on the other hand, I think If We Were Villains forms a much more intimate relationship between the characters and the readers, and it makes these characters very real. Like, they might be dramatic, they might be your usual theater kids, but they are real people. And I really do think that element of If We Were Villains sold the whole dark academia like concept to be way more than The Secret History did. I think If We Were Villains is slightly less pretentious than The Secret History, but what it doesn't have in pretentiousness, it makes up for in theater kid drama. Like, half the time the characters converse in full-on Shakespeare quotes, and I mean, that's fine. You do you, but it's a choice. So, do I think If We Were Villains is a good recommendation for fans of The Secret History? I definitely think so. They both have very similar atmosphere, vibes, settings, character plots. They're not the exact same, but the style and the progression is so similar that I would strongly encourage fans of The Secret History to read If We Were Villains. And I think the bonus of this recommendation is that if you didn't really like The Secret History, but you want to try out the dark academia vibe, or if you like the vibe and you just didn't really like the book, something about it just didn't click with you, you really might like If We Were Villains. I think that this book represents dark academia really well for a general audience and really lightens up on the pretentiousness of the genre. And that was my week testing recommendations from the blurbs of books. Overall, after this week, I definitely understand more about how recommendations are formed between these two books and just how much I can trust them on a personal level. I think that they take a few of the biggest tropes from these books and kind of form connections between them, but it doesn't necessarily mean that these tropes are used in the same way in the book or represented the same way, and I think that is definitely what makes each book so unique and different. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please click like, and if you want to see more, click subscribe, and I'll see you all next time.